Hello and welcome to this lecture on prehistoric cultures. This lecture is a broad, and I do mean broad in the broadest sense of the term, overview of the prehistoric cultures of North America. Specifically, we'll be talking about the two oldest prehistoric cultures of North America and how they relate to the prehistoric history of the Pacific Northwest. This lecture builds upon the discussions that we had in the first lecture on prehistoric human migrations. So if you recall, the new picture is giving us a sense of a migration that is earlier than the land bridge that appeared 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, right? It's giving us a sense of a migration to North and South America that occurred maybe as far back as 30 to 35,000 years ago, maybe 50,000 years ago, maybe even earlier, right? The picture is older than what we appreciated. However, there's still a lot we don't know. And one of the most difficult things about this is there's strong evidence for human habitation and exploitation of the environments of North America in that as early as 30 to 35,000 years ago, maybe even earlier. But the problem that we run into, and that's why among the scholars who study prehistoric North America, there's still some skepticism about the new picture despite the overwhelming evidence. The problem we run into is that there are no discernible cultures in North or South America until about 15 to 10,000 years ago. Now, let me explain what I mean by no discernible cultures. So, archaeologists and anthropologists who specialize in prehistory around the world distinguish groups from one another by distinguishing quote-unquote cultures. And what they mean in this use of the word culture is a group of people living in a geographic area who have similar tool making, similar material culture, meaning tools, weapons, etc., things that they make, and a similar lifestyle. At this time, and we'll talk about something different at the end of this lecture, but at the start of this time period, everyone across the globe, every human is a hunter-gatherer. What that means is they're not sedentary. They don't live in one place. They live in a geographic region that they migrate around throughout the seasons to hunt food and gather wild food. So they're largely hunting game, that meat, animals that they can eat for meat. And then they're gathering wild foods, largely plant matter, right? Like roots or vegetables or fruits that are readily available. Or they're moving around to different hunting grounds and then gathering the wild food available to them. It depends on where you are in the world, but that's what everyone is doing. But what is distinct around the world is the kinds of animals they hunt, the kinds of foods they gather, and the kinds of tools and weapons, etc., that they're making and what they're making them from. They're all making them from stone at this point, or bone or wood, some combination thereof, but because of issues of survivorship, we're largely stuck with the stone. We might find out a little bit of the bone material. Wood material, it's very rare that we ever find any of that. It's just the odds of it surviving are so slim, as well as like any fibers like animal pelts or leather that they're making their clothing out of. It's almost impossible that any of that survives given just degradation and the ravages of time. But we can find the stones. That's the most likely thing we're going to find, and then traces of their settlement, caves they inhabited, campfires, cave art they created, so on and so forth. So everyone around the world is kind of living a similar lifestyle, but they're doing it differently and making things differently, utilizing things differently, and so on and so forth. And those distinctions become cultures for prehistoric scholars. The problem we have in North America is there's not enough evidence to establish what cultures there were from the first migration all the way down to 15,000 to 10,000 years ago when you get Clovis culture. And that has led some skeptical scholars to say this is why we think that the scholarship is wrong and that Clovis is the first discernible culture and thus represents the first migration. As I said in the last lecture, I think the overwhelming amount of evidence, the evidence is overwhelmingly against that, but there are some scholars you will find that still hold to that because we're taking a huge leap in history, right? We're jumping to 15,000 to 10,000 years ago to talk about Clovis culture. That's the first one we're going to talk about. So, the first discernible culture in North and South America is what we call Clovis culture. Now, Clovis culture existed, on the slide here I have 11,900 to 9,000 years ago. Some scholars will say as early as 15,000 years ago, somewhere in that time frame, right? That's where we're talking about, right? Now, Clovis culture gets its name from the first place where archaeological evidence of this culture was found. And that's a place called Clovis, New Mexico. And so because it was first found in Clovis, New Mexico, that gets the name of the culture. So that's where it is. Now, this culture coincided with the last ice age. And you can see on the map here, right, in what is now Canada and the northern parts of North America, including significant portions of the state of Washington, right, you can see here that there are large ice sheets or glaciers covering the land. The climate was much colder back then, and that created a different environment and ecology for Clovis culture. That's important to keep in mind. Clovis culture was a Stone Age culture. They made tools out of stone. I'll show you some of those tools in just a moment. But they made stone tools, stone weapons. They were hunter-gatherers, but they lived in a much different geography and climate than we live in today, even if we happen to live in some of the same lands that these peoples inhabited. We don't know what languages they spoke. We don't know kind of a lot about them, but we do know that they were hunter-gatherers, okay? We know that. And we know that they had to contend with an environment that was vastly different from our own, particularly with respect to the wildlife. These people had to contend with mastodons and woolly mammoths. In fact, we know that they hunted them. They had to contend with ancient bisons, right? And ancient bison were different than the bison or buffalo that we have today. And if you've ever seen a bison or a buffalo, you know how large they are. And they were, and the prehistoric ones were even bigger. They had to live in a world in which there were giant sloths that stood 10 to 15 feet high. They had to contend in a world in which there were saber-toothed tigers, right? Saber-toothed tigers were massive animals that we know would hunt humans if they could get a hold of them, right? They had to contend with giant bears called round-faced bears. And round-faced bears were anywhere from 9 to 13 feet tall when they stood on their hind legs. They were enormous. So the world in which they lived in was very, very different. That's the world that they had to contend with. That's the world in which their culture evolved. Thought I'd talk to you a little bit about Clovis tools, okay? So what you see here are not on the slide here is not the only tools that Clovis made, but it's certainly the iconic tool, the iconic image. When you come across it, you know that it's Clovis. So the Clovis were famous for their spear points, their spearheads made of stone, and you can see them here. Now, on the second slide, you can see that there's various sizes to them, but what I want you to be aware of is they're actually quite large and they're actually quite heavy. Now, I'm going to explain to you how they made them in just a second, but what I want you to know is these spear points you see here that are traditional of Clovis were the cutting edge technology of the day. They were cutting edge technology. You see similar spear points actually in other areas across the world. Not exactly identical, but similar. Clovis was cutting edge technology. So these are all made of stone. So what they do is they take a hammer stone and they shape another stone in order to create these. So it took real skill to create these spear points. Now, you notice I'm calling them spear points and not like arrows or something like that. Because the Clovis spear points were large and therefore they were heavy. These were not meant to be projectiles. I want to say that again. They were not meant to be projectiles. They were not meant necessarily to be thrown. That doesn't mean they weren't thrown. We don't know. But when you sort of reconstruct these things, they certainly were not aerodynamic. And they were certainly not made for throwing and penetrating because you couldn't generate a lot of velocity here. What they were meant for was to get close and pierce. In the Ice Age, the animals that Clovis culture hunted had thick hides, primarily to deal with the cold. So to bring an animal down, you had to have a robust spear point and penetrate. What that meant was Clovis had to get up close and personal with the animals that they hunted, with the ancient bison, with the ancient bison, with the mammoth, with the mastodon, right? They had to get up and close and personal with the animals that they hunted, right? Which meant that they had to hunt in groups for the most part, coordinated groups, because it took a group of spear points to bring these animals down. Now, we know from some of the archaeological data that oftentimes what they did was they would use the spears to wound the animals, to frighten the animals, and kind of elicit a fear response in the animals to get them to run away to an area that was more conducive for them to slaughter the animal. Now, in some cases, that was actually a cliff. We have evidence of Clovis people driving ancient bison, or getting them all afraid and anxious and fleeing humans, and then they just drove them over like a cliff where they would fall to their death, and then you could go down the bottom and harvest the meat. Sometimes they might corner them in an area to make it easier for them to deal with. So there are a variety of hunting techniques that the archaeological record seems to indicate, but at the end of the day, what I want you to be aware of is they had to hunt on foot. They weren't projectiles. They had to get up and close and personal with these animals, which meant that not only were they brave, but they also had to figure out techniques and work out how to do it. Okay. Now these Clovis points, right, are the iconic sort of like tool that Clovis made. You have Clovis when you find these things that are quite long, sometimes up to like a foot or so long and quite heavy. Interestingly enough, the largest collection or cache of these Clovis points ever found was actually found in the state of Washington. It was actually found in East Wenatchee, Washington, on an orchard up by Pangbourne Airport. And so in the 1980s, right, a farmer in an orchard discovered some of these Clovis points, contacted archaeologists, and they did an excavation, and they found dozens of these things, right? The largest grouping of them that were ever found. And they were found in the late 1980s. And I'll just date myself here, right? I grew up in the Wenatchee Valley. And as a school child, I can remember when they found that. And they actually brought the local elementary schools, and I'm from a local community in the Wenatchee Valley called Orondo. And so I was at Orondo Elementary, and they actually invited all the local elementary schools, including my elementary school, to go out and visit the archaeological site. And I can remember as a kid going to the archaeological site and thinking I was in an Indiana Jones movie, but not seeing, sort of a bunch of Nazis to punch, but instead of a archaeologist very methodically creating sort of like layers and profiles and extracting these things. And I can remember seeing Clovis points sticking out where they were excavating. For those of you who don't know, modern archaeology, the ideal excavation technique is that you thoroughly map all levels and all placement of objects in those levels of your excavation site so that you could perfectly place every object back where it was found if necessary, if you want to rebury a dig. Now, some of you might be saying, why would you want to rebury a dig? Well, in a lot of places, there isn't the capacity to preserve archaeological artifacts. And so in many cases, after you do all your studies, if you don't have a way to preserve or place these objects, you just bury them back in site, exactly like you found them, for other archaeologists to someday dig up if they should so choose. For those of you who are interested, at the Wenatchee Valley Museum, there is many of these Clovis points from that cache up in East Wenatchee that are there. But many of these Clovis points were not given to any museums. They weren't conserved for a variety of reasons I won't go into this lecture, and so they were actually buried back in the site. They're actually out there today. Before any of you think, well, I'll just go find that site and dig it up, you'd be violating numerous federal laws and would get into a lot of trouble should you try to do that. So please, please, please don't. But just so you know, once the archaeologists did the initial dig, there's never been any interest in going back and doing it. In addition to these artifacts that were found in East Wenatchee, up by the airport, in addition to the artifacts themselves, the actual site told us something, which is that the reason there were so many spear points up there wasn't because like a bunch of people with their weapons died there and then the sort of like objects just stayed there and eventually the ravages of time buried the bodies and the artifacts. There were no bodies found there. In fact, what the archaeologists could tell when they excavated this site in East Wenatchee is this was a storage depot, that these objects were deliberately buried in place. The question is why? Well, what we know from the geology is it was an ancient lake up there, right? For those of you who are unfamiliar with the area, it's at a slightly higher elevation. So you go up, what today is Grant Road, and you go all the way up there, you're rising in elevation and then it flattens out. And that's, of course, where the airport is on the flat up there. Well, that was an ancient lake bed. And it's very clear that it was a watering hole for the prehistoric animals that Clovis hunted. And so Clovis moved in an area. They moved around in a given territory that they hunted and gathered in. But many times they didn't want to carry all their heavy tools. So when they moved from one part of their territory to another, they would take what they would need, but the rest of it, they might just leave. They would store it. And they knew where it was, and they'd come back and use it and hunt when they were in that area. When they were done, bury it and store it, go move on and come back the next year and use it again. So this was like an ancient safe, an ancient deposit box, an ancient bank, someplace where they stored stuff until they needed it. And then, of course, one day, one season, 1 year, they never came back, and it was just left for us to found. And that told us something really important about Clovis. They were nomadic, or what we might think of as semi-nomadic. They moved around a given territory, but they also didn't carry everything with them, that they often left their excess in one specific area. It was a very interesting find that we had long suspected, but the East Wenatchee site confirmed that this was a common habit. Clovis culture also made other kinds of stone tools like knives and axes for cutting things, or knives for slicing things. We have evidence of that. They made things out of bones, mostly the bones of animals that they had hunted for meat. The same animals they hunted for meat, they used their hides for leather, their furs for clothing. So they were using all of the animal. We also know that they likely made things out of fibers, so ropes and various things out of plant fibers. There's evidence to suggest that, but of course that stuff doesn't survive in the same way. Organic material doesn't survive time as well as like stone and brick and mud and things like that. So we might have suggestions of it based on the archaeological record, but because it doesn't survive as much, it's harder to have firm ideas, because it's unlikely we're going to find much of this material. We know that in general, right? We know that in general, right? Clovis communities were relatively small by modern standards, 25 to 50 people. So a bunch of interrelated families, right? A bunch of interrelated families. We have some evidence that when a family group might get too big, they would sort of shear off, right? Because their lifestyles seem to only be able to support 25, 50, maybe as much as 60 people, right? And so that seems to be their size in a given territory. Now, the territory size of a Clovis culture would vary depending on where you're talking about in North America and what the local environment made available to them. But nonetheless, right, like the number of people was largely the same. We don't have a lot of good evidence for like social hierarchies, how they resolve disputes, or their spiritual beliefs. There is cave art that suggests that Clovis had some spiritual or religious beliefs, but not enough for us to say what those might have been. We haven't found enough fully intact skeletons, like Kennewick Man, to know much about their burial practices, but there is some indication that bodies were ritualistically interned. Now, we used to believe that there was clear differences in responsibility between the sexes, and therefore they had clear gender constructs in Clovis culture. Now let me explain something to you just a little bit. When academics use the term sex, we're talking about a biological understanding of a person, right? So whether someone was sexed male or female. Gender is a social construct. And so people often confuse the two. They might say male and female and think in terms of sex and gender as if they're intertwined, because in much of history they were. But please understand that gender is a social and cultural construct. What we associate with masculinity and femininity, and how we define those, and whether those are the only two options or there's more options within gender, is all about social and sociological choices. So with sex, there is, to a certain extent, a biological component, although recent science is showing us that though even those understandings are more complicated than we originally thought. So we used to think that with respect to sex, that Clovis had strong gendered constructs, and that men were hunters and women were gatherers. We used to think that. There is recent evidence on prehistoric cultures around the world, including Clovis, to challenge that construct, that men were the gatherers and women were, or men were the hunters and women were the gatherers, that it was probably more diverse and nuanced than that there certainly were women who were hunters and men who were gatherers, and that the work may not have been as gendered as we have traditionally assumed. So the new picture is becoming more nuanced. I'm not enough of an expert in this particular field to give you any more information on the scholarship than that, but I do want you to be aware of it. So, what we know about Clovis is fairly limited. So I've just given you a broad overview. We know beginning around 9,000 years ago, so sometime around between 9,000 and 7,000 BCE, we know that Clovis culture began to decline. It began to decline, it began to disappear. There are two reasons for this. One, it's the end of the Ice Age. The climate of the world began to gradually warm, and that changed the environmental conditions of Clovis. Number two, they lost their food source. Now, some people say, well, of course, with the end of the Ice Age and the warming of the climate, things like ancient bison, woolly mammoth, and mastodon, they couldn't deal with the warmer climate. Certainly true. But we also know that Clovis was a tremendously efficient and a tremendously successful group of hunters. They were really good at it. Very good at it. They were so good at it that they were expediting the extinction of these animals. And in doing so, eliminating their food source. The Clovis people themselves don't die off. There's no mass disappearance of the people of Clovis. It's their culture that disappears. Why? Because they have to change, adapt, and evolve to the new climatic conditions and the new animals they're hunting. Their technology is no longer suited for the new realities they find themselves in. And I really want you to be aware of that and understand that. The Clovis people themselves did not die off. Their culture had to change because their environment and their food sources changed. The culture that emerges next is called Folsom culture. And it's called Folsom culture for a place in California where they first found evidence of the culture. Now, Folsom culture appears across North America like Clovis culture. In fact, Folsom culture is the last unified culture of North America, meaning it's the last culture that is common across North America. After Folsom, you'll get regional variations of culture. Culture will evolve and adapt to regional environments. Folsom culture, is roughly at its height from, say, 8,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago, so like 6,000 to 4,000 BCE in North America. Folsom culture is also a Stone Age culture. They made things out of stone and bone and plant fibers, just like Clovis did. They were hunter-gatherers, just like Clovis. The difference is, with the end of the Ice Age, animals became smaller and faster. It was no longer possible to get right up close to them and stab them, or at least it was harder to do. Instead, the animals that you were going to be hunting were going to be further away. You had to surprise them, and you needed projectiles. So you can see some Folsom culture spear points, and they're quite a bit smaller than Clovis spear points, and quite a bit lighter. They were meant to be thrown. Eventually, Folsom culture develops an atlatl. What an atlatl is like a notched, atlatl, if you care, is atlatl, atlatl. What an atlatl is it's basically like a piece of, it's like a medium-sized piece of wood with a notch in it, and you can put a spear in that notch, and then what you do is you fling that piece of wood with the notch containing the spear, you fling it, and you can throw it with enormous accuracy and enormous velocity. Like, picture someone with an atlatl, it takes a spear, and it allows you to throw a spear like 90 miles an hour, like a Major League Baseball fastball, but with quite a bit of accuracy if you know what you're doing. I highly encourage you, if you want to, you can find prehistoric technology enthusiasts who've reconstructed atlatls based on the archaeological evidence, and then go out and sort of like use them. And you can find all sorts of YouTube videos of these people doing it, and you can see how devastatingly accurate and powerful and how penetrative these spear points are. And that's what Folsom culture needed. They were a hunter-gatherer culture, semi-nomadic in a region, all the same things we talked about with Clovis, just different technology. And those same caveats about gender constructs all apply as well. What we thought we knew, we just don't know. So Folsom culture comes next. And like I said, by between 5,000 and 4,000 BCE, fulsome culture then evolves into local cultures that continuously evolve and change until we get to the indigenous cultures or Native American cultures that you will study about in this class and in, U.S. history and Canadian history classes, across the country. Now, before we end this conversation on prehistoric cultures, I think it's important to have a conversation about comparisons and comparatives. Because in this unit of this course, we're trying to understand very broadly indigenous cultures from their earliest origins all the way until the time that they meet with European and American civilization. And when that encounter happens, which we'll start talking about in the second unit and the third unit and so on and so forth, when that encounter happens, one of the things you're going to find is that the Europeans and the Americans are technologically more advanced than the indigenous peoples of North America. And that has led racists and, white supremacists and all sorts of European supremacists and so on and so forth to argue is that the superior technology is because the Europeans, whomever they were, wherever they were from, were inherently superior to the indigenous peoples of North America. And that is categorically false. That's categorically false. It's racist, and it's simply not understanding the historical record, not understanding historical evolution and development. And to dispel this myth, I want to talk to you a little bit about the differences between the quote-unquote old world, remember that term that we use for Europe, Asia, Africa, and the New World, that term we use for South America and North America. And in order to understand the origins and the technological difference between the two groups, you need to understand what happens at the end of the last ice age. Clovis culture was cutting-edge culture. It was as technologically advanced as anything you'd find in the world. And then, as we just discussed, during the last ice age, that culture had to evolve and change to new environmental conditions. The same thing happened in the quote-unquote old world, in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe. And in most places in the quote-unquote old world, what happened is that peoples did exactly what peoples of the New World did. They simply changed technology and became different kinds of hunter-gatherers. However, in pockets in the old world, in places like the Fertile Crescent in Anatolia, in the Indus River Valley, later in the Nile River Valley, later in the Yellow and Yangtze River valleys of China, and a few other places, people made a different decision. Their environment either encouraged or required that they have a different way of procuring food. That they no longer were hunter-gatherers, but they began to farm. They began to develop agriculture. Now, this happened around 10,000 BCE, although it could have happened a little bit earlier, maybe as much as a couple thousand years earlier in places like Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. There are some exciting new archaeological finds with respect to this that will clarify the picture in the coming decades. But they made the move to agriculture. What agriculture is the deliberate domestication of animals and plants for food and for other necessities. Now, what we mean by domestication is you're taking something wild and breeding it and changing it, whether it's a plant or an animal, to produce something that's more useful to you as humans. You're directly responsible for what you need to acquire food and other items. That's agriculture. There has been no larger transformation on the planet than when groups of people stopped being hunter-gatherers and they moved to agriculture. You can take a class in Western or Eastern civilizations, and we offer both of these at this college to be able to really explore that more fully, more fundamentally. But that's effectively what happened, is that people make the move to agriculture, and it fundamentally transforms the way they live. Agriculture requires you to be more sedentary. Some kinds of agriculture are more sedentary than others. It requires you to develop different kinds of technology, different kinds of housing, different kinds of social and political and religious constructs. It totally transforms the way you live. And in doing so, it really transforms technology. Agriculture requires a lot more technology, a lot more tools and technological innovations than hunting and gathering does. And because agricultural civilizations, if they succeed, tend to be wealthier than hunter-gatherer civilizations, people begin to copy and emulate agricultural civilizations. And you see that right in the quote-unquote old world. Agriculture starts in a handful of pockets, and then through trade and travel, it spreads, and other people start to adopt it to the point where it becomes the dominant form of lifestyle in the quote-unquote old world by the time of the age of exploration. Hunter-gatherers exist, but mostly in like the Arctic or Siberia or parts of Southeast Asia or parts of Africa, but almost everywhere else on all those continents, agriculture has become dominant. And with that, all the technological innovation. And then trade develops all across Asia and Europe and Africa, and there's an exchange of ideas that then generates all sorts of new technological innovation. And that then is why Europeans have the technology they do when they arrive in the Americas. It's not because they're superior in any way. That's just racist nonsense. It's because where the environment of the quote-unquote old world had encouraged and led to all these innovations. By contrast, in the New World, most people could transition to hunting and gathering. It was still a possibility as long as you technologically adapted to the new animals and gathering. It wasn't until around 5000 BCE that in places like Mexico and some pockets of South America began to develop agriculture. And even then, it was a very different agriculture than evolved in the Old World. In the Old World, the plants they domesticated, the animals they domesticated, were domesticated in specific areas, but then they could be taken to other areas of the Old World, to places that didn't have them. And they did very well there. By contrast, right, in North and South America, they had no animals suitable for, like helping them clear fields and plow fields. So that limited the size of their agriculture in some ways. They didn't have the same readily and arguably easier to domesticate not just plants, not just animals, but plants for food sources. So there were limitations there. And yet these civilizations that developed agriculture did tremendously impressive and wonderful things with those limitations. But agriculture never takes over the Americas in the same way it takes over the Old World. And as a consequence, there's not the technological change that accompanies agriculture. And then there's not the trade links across continents like there was in the Old World that encouraged even more technological innovation. And that's what accounts for the technological difference between the peoples of North and South America and the peoples of the Old World when Europeans meet them. It has nothing to do with a superior civilization or a superior people. That's just nonsense and ahistorical and runs counter to what happened. In history, no one changes their lifestyle if they have to. And the fact of the matter is, a hunting and gathering lifestyle was a perfectly readily available lifestyle for peoples of North and South America And so they didn't make the change to agriculture because they didn't have to. Some people did, as I mentioned. And with it came really impressive technological civilizations. But other people's didn't have to. And that doesn't make their civilizations and culture and societies any less impressive or inferior in any way to what comes later. And I just want to make that abundantly clear to you as we move forward. All right. I thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.